In this instructional video, we want to look at declaring and assigning strings. Again, I'm working off a program that's available called Demo3, and it's available to you in the outbox. You'll notice that, again, I'm declaring all my variables. So in this case, I've declared integer variables mark subject 1, mark subject 2, subject 3, and subject 4. So I've declared 4 variables to hold my subject marks. And then I have an integer variable called sum of marks. So I'm going to calculate the total of these 4 marks to arrive at the sum. I've got a variable for average. You'll notice that all these variables are integer. I've also created a variable to hold a decimal average. As well, I've created this variable called name of student, and you'll notice that the variable type is string. The other thing you should notice is that it's not the same color as int and double. Int and double are primitive variable types. They are always start with a lowercase letter, lowercase I and lowercase t. You'll notice that string starts with a capital. String is not a primitive data type. String is what's referred to as a class, and we'll talk further about that later. For now, you'll notice that the way we declare a string is basically the same. The data type followed by the name of the variable. You'll notice now in step 2, where I assign values, I've assigned integer numbers to subject 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I've assigned a string to name of student. The string again is enclosed in double quotes, and you'll notice that the text is in the color of green. Now let's move on to our processing step. In our processing step, I've outlined an expression to calculate my total marks, or my sum of marks. So I'm adding marks in subject 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'm assigning the result to sum of marks. In the next step, I'm calculating the average. So I'm taking the sum of marks and dividing by 4. And I'm calculating it 2 different ways. I'm calculating it with an integer division, and I'm calculating it with a decimal division. If we calculate it with an integer division, notice that average mark and sum of marks are both integer variables. So we'll look at the result, and we'll also look at the result for our decimal division. And then of course I'm printing our sum of marks, printing name of the student with their average, both as an integer average and as a decimal average. So let's compile and look at the result. Okay, so we see that the sum of all these marks, 12 plus 9 plus 99 plus 89, adds up to 209. When we divide 209 by 4, we get an answer of 52. So that's the second print line, where we're printing the average mark, which is arrived at using integers. And when we print the third line, we're printing the result of 52.25 that we get when we find the average using a decimal calculation. Now you'll notice that our decimal answer prints from average mark decimal, and average mark decimal is a variable that has been declared as a double. Now what would happen if instead of dividing by 4.0 we divide by 4? You notice that average mark is a double, but sum of marks is an integer, and now that I've removed the decimal 0, we're dividing by an integer as well. So let's compile and run. And you'll notice now that our average marks in decimal is printing as 52.0, not 52.25. And this is because Java will calculate doing integer math. Sum of marks is an integer, 4 is an integer. If we do integer division, then we drop the decimals, and even though average mark decimal is a double, we only get it to print as a double, but the answer is a decimal, is not a decimal answer. The answer is an integer because we've divided by an integer. So Java will look at the variable data type and will look at literal numbers and assume a data type for them. A 4 is an integer number. An integer divided by an integer gives an integer result. That integer result can then be saved to a double variable, but by that time we've already lost our decimals. So if you want an answer with a decimal, then we need to have our calculation done with a decimal, and that means that you need to make this a 4.0 if you want to see the same result that you would calculate on your calculator. Of course, let's run that. And there's the result on the third line that we would have expected. If you try to do this with an integer variable, let's see what happens. Sorry, let's compile. And you'll notice that we get a loss of precision error, and that's because we're taking an integer, dividing by a double. Java promotes the integer to double, tries to do arithmetic that includes a decimal, but then when it goes to save it into an integer variable, it says that it won't fit, basically. And so that's what loss of precision is that we have to drop the decimals to save it. Java won't allow it. It found a double answer on the right side of the equal sign, but it required an integer to save it on the left. So that won't be allowed. So what we want then is if we want a decimal, we need a decimal variable to save the answer to, and we need to do decimal math, meaning if we use literal numbers, be careful that you don't have integers throughout your calculation, because the result will be an integer. So let's recompile. And now back to our string. Well, you notice that we assigned a value to the string here, and when we use the variable in our print statement, we get the string to print, and that's basically no different than using a numeric variable. The answer or the number or value that the variable represents or holds is printed, and likewise for a string variable. And that concludes this instructional video.